For 45 years, the world believed Richard Harley was a successful man with a perfect life. He lived in a large, elegant house on a quiet street lined with old oak trees. The kind of house people slowed down to admire. White walls gleaming in the morning sun, tall windows reflecting the greenery outside, and a perfectly trimmed lawn. From the outside, everything looked calm, stable, and respectable. Inside that house lived Eleanor Harley, his wife of 45 years. She had once been known for her bright smile and gentle laughter. People remembered how graceful she looked when she walked, how warmly she spoke to everyone she met. But time had softened her steps and quieted her voice. Years of silence had a way of doing that. Eleanor spent most of her days in the same routine. She woke up early, long before Richard prepared breakfast even though she knew he wouldn't thank her. Cleaned rooms that were already clean, and folded clothes that no one noticed. And every morning, she reminded herself of one thing: just get through today. Their marriage hadn't always been like this. Once, long ago, Richard had looked at Eleanor as if she were the center of his world. He used to hold her hand in public and ask her opinion on things that mattered. But success changed him. As his business grew, his patience shrank. As his name became respected outside, his respect for his wife faded inside the house. Eleanor didn't complain. She believed marriage meant endurance. She believed loyalty mattered more than happiness. So she stayed silent when he dismissed her words, stayed quiet when he stopped coming home on time, forgave him when he stopped listening altogether. Years passed, decades passed, and slowly Eleanor became invisible in her own home. It was a cold morning when everything changed. Eleanor was setting the table, her hands slightly shaking as she placed Richard's favorite cup near his chair. She had made his breakfast exactly the way he liked it, out of habit more than hope. Richard entered the dining room already irritated, his phone in his hand, his eyes locked on the screen. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood there and said something Eleanor never expected to hear. "I want you out of this house." Eleanor froze. The words didn't make sense at first. They floated in the air like a foreign language. "I'm serious," Richard said, finally looking at her. "I've had enough." Eleanor's heart pounded. "Enough of what?" she asked softly. "Enough of this," he replied, gesturing around. "Enough of you." Eleanor felt the room spin. 45 years of memories, birthdays, late nights, shared struggles, quiet sacrifices, all reduced to a single moment of rejection. "You can't mean that," she whispered. Richard sighed, clearly annoyed. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. The house is in my name. I want you gone by tonight. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Tonight." Eleanor's legs weakened. She held the edge of the table to steady herself. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked. "That's not my problem anymore," Richard replied coldly, then grabbed his coat and walked out, leaving his untouched breakfast behind. Eleanor stood there for a long time, staring at the door. She didn't cry right away. Shock has a strange way of numbing pain. When she finally moved, she walked upstairs slowly, as if every step weighed more than the last. She opened the closet. Most of the space was still Richard's. She pulled out an old suitcase from the corner, one she hadn't used in years. She packed only the essentials: clothes, a few photographs, and her wedding ring, which she removed from her finger with trembling hands. She paused when she found an old picture, showing a younger Richard and Eleanor, smiling, standing close together. She stared at it for a long moment before placing it back inside the drawer. Some memories were too heavy to carry. As evening approached, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone. There was only one number she could call. She hadn't dialed it in decades. Her fingers hovered over the screen, doubt filling her mind. Would he even answer? She took a deep breath and pressed call. It rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. Eleanor? Her eyes filled with tears. Yes, she whispered. It's me. There was silence on the other end, not cold silence, but stunned silence. I didn't think I'd ever hear your voice again, the man said softly. I didn't think I'd ever need to call, Eleanor replied. The man on the phone was Thomas Reed, her younger brother. Richard had never spoken his name. Years ago, Richard had dismissed Thomas as irrelevant, a man who didn't fit into his world of ambition and appearances. Eleanor had stayed quiet then too. I need help, she said, her voice breaking. He wants me out tonight. There was no hesitation. Where are you? Thomas asked firmly. I'm still at the house, she replied. Stay there, he said. I'm coming. That same evening, Richard sat in his office downtown, relaxed and confident. He believed he had everything under control. The lawyer had assured him there would be no complications. Eleanor had no power, no leverage, no voice. She'd figure it out, Richard muttered to himself. He had no idea that one phone call had already changed everything. It was dark when the black car stopped outside the house. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, curious. Thomas stepped out calmly, dressed simply, but with an air of authority that was impossible to miss. He walked to the door and knocked. Eleanor opened it slowly. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Thomas pulled her into a gentle embrace. You're not alone anymore, he said quietly. As Thomas stepped inside the house, his eyes scanned the walls, the furniture, the life Eleanor had endured. He said nothing, but his expression changed. You don't need to leave, he said calmly. Eleanor looked confused. He said, I know what he said, Thomas replied. Now let me handle this. That night, Thomas made a call of his own, a call Richard never imagined Eleanor could make. Richard returned home late, expecting an empty house. Instead, he found lights on and a man sitting calmly in the living room. Richard frowned. Who are you? Thomas stood up slowly. I'm Eleanor's brother, he said. And tomorrow, we're going to talk. Richard laughed dismissively. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Thomas smiled, not arrogantly, but knowingly. Oh, he said quietly. I think you're the one who doesn't know. That night, Eleanor slept in the house she had almost lost. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Hope. And Richard. He slept confidently, completely unaware that the life he built over 45 years was about to collapse. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through truth. The next morning, Richard woke up early as usual, expecting silence and emptiness, a house finally freed from Eleanor's presence. He stretched, yawned, and glanced at the clock. Everything seemed normal. He poured himself a cup of coffee and took a slow sip, scanning the quiet living room. But there was a strange tension in the air he couldn't place, a feeling that something had shifted, though he couldn't see it. Across the street, neighbors were busy with their routines, unaware of the quiet storm brewing inside the Harley residence. Richard's confidence, built over decades, gave him a sense of invincibility. He didn't suspect that the life he carefully constructed, brick by brick, was beginning to crumble with invisible cracks. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, watching the sunlight fall softly through the tall windows. She felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear, because the man she had loved for decades had just turned his back on her, and relief, because she was no longer alone. Thomas had stayed the night, ensuring she was safe and calm. He had spoken very little, only enough to reassure her that everything would be okay. We don't act in anger, he had said the night before. We act with clarity. He will see the truth soon. Eleanor had nodded, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. A part of her that she had almost forgotten. The part that used to laugh freely, hope boldly, and believe in her own worth had begun to awaken. As Richard prepared for his usual morning meeting, he remained oblivious to the quiet strategizing happening inside his home. He had believed for years that control was about power, appearances, and influence. But Thomas was a different kind of force, one that didn't rely on threats, money, or intimidation. Thomas relied on knowledge, understanding, and patience. He had spent years building a life of quiet influence, connections, and expertise that Richard never thought to investigate. This wasn't a man who would react with emotion. This was a man who would act with precision. And Richard had no idea he was already cornered in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Eleanor watched as her brother paced slowly through the living room, occasionally stopping to glance at the walls, the furniture, and the life Richard had tried to claim as his own. "Everything he values is here," Thomas said softly. "But it is fragile because it is built on neglect and illusion." Eleanor nodded, feeling a surge of courage. For so long, she had believed that she had no voice, that she had no power. But with Thomas by her side, she began to understand that power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, persistent, and inevitable. By mid-morning, Richard's lawyer called, reminding him of Eleanor's legal standing. He waved the call off impatiently, confident that he had already secured the upper hand. But then another call came. This one from a man Richard didn't recognize. Someone claiming to have urgent information about a business decision Richard had made years ago. Richard's curiosity was piqued, but he dismissed the man brusquely, promising to return the call later. He had no idea that this seemingly casual conversation was the first of many dominoes that would fall, setting in motion events he could never reverse. Thomas, meanwhile, had begun to make subtle moves. He contacted people from Richard's professional and personal circles, gathering details about Richard's decisions, past misjudgments, and overlooked consequences. He didn't threaten anyone, didn't demand loyalty or secrets. He simply reminded people of facts, of truths Richard had long ignored. By the afternoon, Eleanor began to notice changes in the atmosphere around the house. The quiet hum of life that had always seemed oppressive felt different now, lighter, charged with possibility. She realized she was not just surviving anymore. She was participating in a story that was being rewritten, carefully, deliberately. Richard returned home in the early evening, confident and relaxed. He found the front door unlocked, the lights on, and a note on the coffee table. It was from Thomas, brief and almost casual. "We need to talk. Tonight. Alone." Richard frowned, irritated. He didn't like surprises, especially not from a man he considered irrelevant. But curiosity and pride got the better of him. He entered the living room and found Thomas seated calmly, as if he had been waiting for hours. "You're early," Thomas said quietly. Richard scowled, trying to mask his growing unease. "I can come back," he said, though he knew he wouldn't. Thomas shook his head slightly. "No, now is better." The conversation that followed was deliberate, measured, and unlike anything Richard expected. Thomas didn't shout or accuse. He didn't demand or threaten. He simply outlined truths Richard had ignored. Mismanaged decisions, forgotten promises, missteps in business, and the unnoticed ways he had failed the people who trusted him most. Eleanor listened quietly from the side, her heart racing, but also feeling a deep satisfaction. This was not revenge. It was revelation. Every word Thomas spoke chipped away at the illusion Richard had maintained for decades. By the end of the evening, Richard was exhausted, confused, and beginning to realize that the house he thought he controlled was no longer his alone in any meaningful way. That night, Richard sat in his study, staring blankly at papers and contracts, trying to reconcile what he had learned. He had always believed that success was about accumulation, wealth, power, influence. But now he saw that success without integrity, empathy, or respect could be fragile, brittle, and hollow. Eleanor, meanwhile, slept peacefully, for the first time in decades feeling truly safe, valued, and understood. Thomas had ensured that she would no longer be invisible in her own home or in her own life. Slowly, Eleanor realized that the past 45 years, filled with endurance, quiet sacrifice, and patience, had not been wasted. They had prepared her for this moment, the moment when truth, courage, and careful strategy would finally intersect, bringing justice not with anger, but with inevitability. In the following days, Richard began to notice subtle changes. People he had relied upon professionally started questioning decisions he had taken for granted. Allies who had been loyal now hesitated, reconsidered, and even opposed certain moves. It was as if an invisible current had shifted under his feet. Thomas had quietly activated networks, contacts, and evidence that exposed Richard's oversights without casting Eleanor in the shadow of confrontation. Richard felt the first twinges of panic not for his wealth, but for the reality he had ignored for decades. He realized, finally, that neglect, arrogance, and disregard for others carry consequences, sometimes invisible until the right moment. Eleanor, meanwhile, began to rediscover herself. She laughed again, softly at first, then with more confidence. She began reading books she had set aside long ago, took walks through the gardens, and reconnected with old friends. She realized she had lived too long in quiet shadows. But now, with Thomas's presence and guidance, she could reclaim not just her house, but her life. There was no malice in this reclamation, no vengeful satisfaction. It was simply recognition. Eleanor had always been here, always been valuable, and finally, the world around her had to acknowledge it. Richard's confidence continued to falter. Each phone call, each meeting, each piece of correspondence reminded him of mistakes he had once ignored. He began to understand that control is an illusion when respect, loyalty, and truth are absent. Eleanor did not need to fight. She did not need to yell. Her power was quiet, deliberate, and unstoppable. Thomas had taught her a lesson Richard would never forget: that true influence does not rely on intimidation, wealth, or appearances. It relies on awareness, strategy, and moral clarity. By the end of the second week, Richard realized that his world had changed. He looked around the house, now filled with laughter, quiet conversation, and purpose, and understood that his era of dominance was over. Eleanor, once silent and invisible, now walked with confidence, spoke with clarity, and lived with the knowledge that her life was hers to reclaim. Thomas remained a calm, guiding presence, ensuring that every step forward was deliberate, ethical, and unavoidable. Richard had learned, perhaps too late, that power without understanding, without empathy, without respect, could crumble silently, without warning, under the quiet force of truth.